Welcome back to Jobs, Money, Debt, Economic Common Sense. New online bi-weekly video for debunking myths concerning unemployment, deficits, the national debt in our monetary system, and how we can create sustainable prosperity for the 21st century. Let the discussion commence. Last time, we began to discuss government budgets and the national debt, looking at the deficit hawk arguments and other contemporary misunderstandings concerning money and fiscal policy. This week, we'll continue with this, but I also want to step back in our discussion and pick up on some of the issues we raised 2 weeks ago when we talked about modern money as a way to go deeper into functional finance. To sum up from that episode, by modern money, we mean money that has no intrinsic value and is not convertible into any other commodity or currency at a fixed exchange rate. Since the state is also the money monopolist, it doesn't need revenue from taxing or borrowing in order to spend. The state imposes a tax payable only in its own monopoly money to create a demand for this intrinsically worthless currency and give it value. It should be clear that there are crucial differences between the state as currency issuer and households, firms, and even local governments that are currency users. This reveals the fallacy of the analogy often made by politicians and the media between the government budget and a household budget. A currency issuer's spending is not going to be revenue constrained. Currency issuers spend by issuing currency. They don't operate with a financial constraint. In modern money systems, in which government issues its own non-convertible floating currency, government spends by crediting a bank account or writing a check. Logically, the state couldn't tax or borrow its own monopoly money before it had spent or lent it into the economy. So, just as the government currency issuer doesn't need to generate revenue by taxing in order to spend, it doesn't need to borrow its own monopoly money in order to spend. The purpose of government bond sales is not to raise revenue, but to manage aggregate bank reserves and set short-term, overnight, or interbank interest rates. We'll go into this in more detail in future episodes. Functional finance, then, is the idea that policies should be judged on their ability to achieve the goals for which they were designed and not on any notion of whether they are sound or otherwise comply with the dogmas of traditional economics. What matters are the effects of any particular budget stance or policy. If we're running a deficit and the economy is prospering, who cares if we have a deficit? And if we have a balanced budget and the economy is tanking, who cares that we have a balanced budget? What matters are the effects of any particular budget stance. As I wrote in an article back in 1999, promoting a balanced budget or paying down the national debt, regardless of the macroeconomic effects, should be called dysfunctional finance. For every buyer, there must be a seller. For every purchase, there is a sale of exactly equal value. For every debt, there is an asset of equal value. My deficit is your surplus. My debt is your asset. It is impossible for there to exist a debt somewhere in an economy without there being corresponding wealth in that economy of equal value. And if the debt decreases by some amount, it must be the case that wealth decreases by the same amount. Assets equal liabilities. It's double entry bookkeeping. Yet the government budget deficit is discussed by politicians and journalists as if it exists in isolation. No one asks how it shows up on the other side of the accounting ledger. The national debt is discussed as if it exists in isolation. We have to ask the questions: where is the surplus corresponding to the government deficit? Where are the assets corresponding to the national debt? The government budget deficit is just accounting information. It tells us how much the non-government sector wants to net save in assets denominated in the domestic currency. The government deficit is the mirror image of the non-government surplus in this basic macro accounting identity, where non-government includes both the domestic or resident private sector, including both firms and households, and foreign or non-resident households and firms, and foreign governments. Deficits do not reduce savings, as deficit hawks argue. Deficits create savings. If you want to decrease the budget deficit, then you're going to have to decrease the non-government surplus. If you want to eliminate the government deficit, you're going to have to eliminate the private sector surplus. If you want to run a government surplus, you're going to have to live with a private sector deficit. If you want to lower the national debt, you're going to have to lower national wealth by the same amount. Let's change the fear-mongering national debt clock near Times Square in New York City and all over the internet to the national wealth clock. As Nobel Prize winning economist William S. Vickery put it, the public debt is not an economic sin, but an economic necessity.